Hi, Rosie. Hi, Alice. Thank you for again for having me. Um, I maybe as this whole Black Lives Matter thing is uh, all over the news, I think it's good to always talk about it and give everybody thoughts about it, because I'm actually thinking what can we do in regards to this Black Lives Matter beyond somehow saying that you're against racism, no? Of course, I'm talking about it with my close friends, but maybe this is a nice platform to quickly share some of my thoughts. Definitely as a young father, with kids of 3 years old and one of 1 year old, I've once there's this wonderful documentary in Holland called "White is Also a Color," it's this documentary maker Sunny Bergman who somehow tries to reflect on this topic of racism and the position of colored people in our society. And she had a very wonderful way of looking at it. And I'm hearing it more and more in programs as we speak, that it's not a question if you're for or against racism. It's more, of course not, but it's more the question if that you realize that everybody is racist until a certain extent, that somehow there is a part of us which is somehow a protective system where you are uncertain about the unknown and about other people and other groups. And it's not so much that you should try not to be racist, but you should be aware of being that you're a racist, and somehow in that sense much more closely analyze the problem. And she had this wonderful, and that's maybe I want to say this then to the parents, she had this wonderful experiment with young children, which are like 4 years old. And she gave all the children a little sign with 5 drawings of 5 kids, a cartoon drawing, exactly the same kid, but only the skin color changed slowly. And she asked these children, they were like 4 years old, 5 years old, so they didn't have any conception of conscious racism whatsoever. Things like who is the smartest of these kids, and they all pointed to the white kid, and they asked them who has done something bad, and they all pointed to the darker kid. And it's somehow apparent how closely part of our psyche is that you have these preconceptions. And then they interviewed the parents, and all these parents were like us. They said like, no, I don't see color. I don't raise my children trying to be racist or seek or make a difference between people. And there was one kid. Sorry, I always get a bit sensitive in this sense. There was one kid that somehow said, how do you say it? There was also one question, who is the boss? And they all pointed to the white kid. And there was one kid who said, nobody's the boss, everybody's the boss about himself. And then they asked that mother what she did differently. And that I thought was very beautiful, that mother didn't say everybody's the same. That mother said, sorry, I don't know why, maybe because I have young kids. That mother said, racism exists and there are these preconceptions in the world, and she didn't sugarcoat it for her children. And I thought that was very beautiful, and in that sense, I think, like I said, we have to be aware that we are racist rather than trying to pretend we're not, and somehow, and therefore be much more honest with ourselves, and somehow can be able to much more consciously counteract our subconscious bias, our subconscious racism. And as an architect, I'm also fully aware if I'm doing an excursion and I go look at buildings that probably nobody's interested in. You all often look around the corner or ring a bell to see if somebody's home, or sneak over the hedge of the garden and see what the back of the building looks like. And if then somebody sees me, they say, what are you doing here? And then I can explain, yeah, I'm an architect, and it's an interesting building. And also here, I'm like fully aware that this is not the same for everybody, that somehow if you have a colored skin, people might have different preconceptions. And even if they don't, you still have the fear that you might run into somebody with these preconceptions. So even though you feel like you have your own liberties, or the world is the same for everybody else, it's not in that sense. I don't know, maybe for a lot of people this might have been already a thought they had before, but maybe for some it wasn't. And I think it's just good to somehow keep telling each other these kind of observations, and why not now. So I wanted to say that before I started. Okay, good. Thank you. So I want to show some of the things I did with the students the past 2 semesters at the university in Aachen, in the chair of Anne Bernhard, the chair of building typology. It's a wonderful chair, and she always gives me a lot of liberty to somehow do my own little one-man studio in between everything else. And I always get a lot of fun with these German students who are very rigorous, as well as questioning a lot. And as most of my lectures is largely based also in my own travels and my own journeys, my own observations. So the past week I have been constantly traveling behind my computer screen through all my past trips to trying to tell a story, somehow part of the story, to illustrate the story of what I'm looking for. The story often also begins with a theme that is more present in my thinking, is that somehow how buildings age, how you can deal with different layers of history, what are the qualities of that, and how to reflect these quite ancient principles on a very contemporary architecture. And maybe starting with this image of the Duomo in Siena, where a part of the Duomo it was planned to be extended twice as large, but due to the plague, midway construction, a lot of most people died, and the extension wasn't necessary anymore, let alone realistic. And somehow this half-built church was left in the city and found a new life. And of course, the beautiful thing about this is that it's a space that is unintended. That was never meant to be like this, but it somehow got reattributed over time. And I'm interested in these moments in the city that are unintended against these moments in the city that are very intended. And I'm also want to ask the question, like, what does it mean for the contemporary city? Like, what are unintended places in the contemporary city? And are we aware of these places, that they can have a quality? Siena, the unbuilt cathedral, and in a way the contemporary back end of the city. Question is if it's intended or not. But maybe I want to start my story with the classical garden, which somehow divided the city into three, the garden into three layers: the formal garden, the cultivated landscape, and in the back the uncontrolled rural nature. And I'm wondering, we can also find these places in the city today. So I always like to somehow take these theoretical images and look at pictures that I took that somehow remind me of these moments. So a formal garden in Münster, and then the complete informal lakes above Berlin, and of course the formal garden and the informal nature somehow also allowing you to somehow behave in a completely different way. So so in that sense, extending the range of human interaction. I guess here at these beautiful cemeteries by Lutyens, you could say the formal garden is the cemetery itself, which is cleanly cut, and then the cultivated landscape or the informal nature is then the landscape around it. And even without anything on it, you still see this beautiful difference between the formal lawn and the informal landscape, cultivated landscape. And then sometimes they even get built quite literally, like here in Rotterdam, where you have this formal garden in front of the little manor house, looking onto this landscape by Zocher in the distance. And I guess a famous one is, of course, the Sanssouci Park, with the Schinkel interventions in it. The name of the German architect now slips my mind, who made the landscape, but you can see this beautiful contrast between this formal garden looking out to this informal landscape onto the next formal object further in the distance. And even the cultivated landscape is somehow translated by this grid of trees in front of the Romischer Bäder, and it's this very beautiful sequence from something very formal to something very informal. And it also happens the other way around, where even within the architecture there are these layers of formality and informality, all to somehow accommodate this. And my question is, in a way, what could this theory be in architecture and in modern architecture? I will get to that in a second. Maybe you could say a quite direct relation in the past was, of course, that the informal could be captured in a grotto, here the Palazzo del Tè, or here the Palazzo Pitti, where still within the realm of architecture, these informal, like cave-like spaces were put against the architecture. Where I think it might be getting interesting is at the moment of Baroque, where here at Zwinger in Dresden, you have these moments where the architecture, of course, creates these very formal compositions shaping the city as such, even though the structures are beautifully informally placed within the city. But then, as you get closer, the Baroque layers often become so much and so splendid that slowly they start to shift alongside each other, almost creating an informal moment. The Nymphenburg, where here, if you look at the top, you have all these beautiful balconies crossing each other, really creating really incidents somehow. I think Semper designed parts of it, but something just arise from the geometry of the stairs and create these beautiful incidental moments on top. And at some point you really feel like you are then again in this uncontrolled nature, even though you started off from this formal architecture. Oxford, in a way, on an urban level, for me, also tells the same story, where you have these very formal quads, and then these are placed, and somehow the space within just happens accidentally, often very causally, and again allowing for this range from the formal garden, for the formal and informal behavior to happen within this range. And of course, the beauty of Oxford is also that it's all built in the same stone, and therefore somehow still maintaining a relation between the informal accidental spaces and the formal spaces on the other side. And of course, this is a story of the city, as we have in many cities. Cities can also be very informal, with these layers of time slowly growing. And the nice thing is then that definitely these old cities, they are then trying to make sense of it after the fact by adding like these formalized elements, slowly delineating again a moment of formality. Lecce is a very beautiful example, also all built in one stone. And there's this very messy city, and all throughout the city there are these strong screens of these churches, slit in the city, somehow trying to make sense of the city. And also here in Sicily, in a little mountain village, which is super dense and almost nonsensical, the church still gives some kind of a peace, even though it's very thin. And I guess it's nice also in Rome and other places to look at these moments. And yeah, sometimes these images of Goan, Padua, or no, this is Padua, Palermo. And of course in Rome, Sixtus with his columns trying to structure the city at that time, giving direction to all the religious movements through the city, also by implementing all these obelisks, shaping the city. So in a way, adding a formal element to an informal city. And it's always nice that this virus of the obelisk then grew over the country, and even in the north of England, in Scotland, there are these large obelisks on graveyards, or lost in between contemporary London. So maybe to then question what this story of order and incident could be on the architectural level. It's nice to look at this Palazzo Vecchio, which starts off with a lot of well-intended royalty, Medici family members, who each try to build upon this palace with another large formal gesture, but they somehow never seem to really be able to align these formal gestures to each other. And actually, so you have the large hall and here this column room, and then here the courtyard. Actually, it delivers these wonderful moments. So between these formalized structures, they always have a problem somehow aligning it to the next space. So here there's this courtyard where you enter, and then you have this double-breasted staircase coming down, but somehow they didn't manage to align it, and they had to add this slanted sides to the door, which actually gives a beautiful layered system together with the columns in the back, and of course the large central hall having to deal with different heights of the surrounding spaces, or spaces having different heights from room to room, and somehow the staircases flowing into each other like a little waterfall from the one to the other. corner doors being pushed in corners, or friezes which seem to be more important than the way the windows looked on the outer facade. Exterior facades, which now all of a sudden become interior facades as the palace evolves, and more misalignments in that sense. And you find them in the most wonderful spaces. This was a house where I stayed in with my family when I was 23. And it was this half timbered house, and the structure apparently needed to be more three-dimensional to really hold up the walls, and they create these very wonderful accidents within the space. And in a way, so what I'm saying is, what's nice about these spaces is that, like the uncontrolled nature in a way in the formal garden, these are somehow the unintended pieces of architecture. And in a way you feel that. You feel that this is a moment where you are not in dialogue with another architect that somehow had an intention and a direction with this, but you just somehow, you are yourself the creator, the observer of this moment. You are yourself the discoverer of this moment. Only your understanding shapes this space. Like when you're in nature, you are the only one that somehow discovers that clearing in the forest, in that sense. And coming to modernism, I think, of course, there also has been this fascination with the formal classical garden, where this drawing of Le Corbusier shows, of course, the very formalized modern architecture against the informal nature, and even the informal architecture in the form of a ruin in the distance. And of course, within their architecture, they always somehow try to incorporate this layer against the formal living, the informal nature, where you can behave in this other way, is all around. But somehow most of these kind of early modernistic neighborhoods always seem to be mainly formal, and somehow the nature never seems to really be able to fulfill that role of the informal counterpart. I think they're very beautiful, but in a way, for the studio, I was curious to look if we can find these informal places also within these kind of more modern dogmas, and they become more and more formal as you go on. I mean, I guess maybe if you have some examples where it did work, is somehow this CISA project in Malagueira, where he has these very formal moments, like the city square, and even the houses adhere to a very clear delineage and this very clear materiality. But he quite consciously builds these informal accidents, and they are so obvious that it really doesn't look like something which never finished, but it feels like he somehow consciously misaligned this and let these mistakes happen within the formal structure. And I'm also more confident that these are conscious things, because he somehow dials up the contrast in moments where there are these very informal waterway structures, almost reminding of old Roman aqueducts, and then quite right directly next to it, very fine materials like red marble are placed, which are the only moments where it's done. So it's this very harsh contrast of something very controlled and something very uncontrolled. and also in this other project, Buka, he's playing with this idea of the rigid order and the very dogmatic system, but then slowly mistakes are happening, and there are things which also seem to be built without meaning, where as a visitor you feel it's not a stair meant by the architect, but you are able to discover this place yourself, or the rhythm just runs into the wall and creates these wonderful moments where it's just a multiplication of the orders somehow let loose, and somehow the result is something that is there, but that doesn't feel to be there with much intent, giving actually a wonderful contrast to this very formal fronts of these buildings. In Turin, there's also a beautiful example in this modernist neighborhood, where of course most buildings are very strict. From the 70s, there are these two architects, Giaretti, and the second name also sadly flew my mind. I have to not finish these lectures just before they start. And they also somehow played with these systems of the surroundings, almost in my mind, but quite consciously looked for ways to somehow derail their orders, and with very beautiful results coming from it. And I think often in these informal spaces, somehow the things that then are added make a lot more sense, no? the buckets, or it somehow allows for a bit more looseness. This is also them, and this is also them. But of course here they then create a fully informal structure. And in a way I'm interested in this balance between the formal and the informal, and how they somehow fulfill each other, like in the classical garden. So we thought we should also look for some formal neighborhoods to deal with the studio. Of course, there's the big one in Amsterdam, the Bijlmer, but there's a very much more sensible one, which is Pendrecht, just south of Rotterdam, which is a beautiful neighborhood. Really nothing wrong with it. And there are these beautiful orders of cleanly designed concrete and brick buildings with large panes of glass. So with the students, we went out and we went to Pendrecht to look at these buildings. And as you can see here, there's a great virtue in somehow the use of these modern materials. With yeah, there's not much I have to add to the images, I guess. A wonderful sense of different kinds of scales, even memories of an older Dutch history, but then scaling up again to larger apartment blocks. But I was curious if we could somehow, on this plan of Pendrecht, find a way to introduce an informal layer, using not the nature, but by using architecture. So as nature then maybe doesn't weigh up to the architecture as the informal counterpart, maybe the architecture itself should be the informal layer, like in a way these older city centers where but the city makes both the formal and the informal. So each student got one existing housing block, and they had to add a collective function, because of course that is greatly lacking in this neighborhood, beyond the church and the school. had to add a public function to these buildings that both on the scale of the building create an informal layer, as well as the scale of the city create an informal layer, somehow organizing the way the city is experienced. Maybe you can see it a bit better in this close-up shot. So this is how it is today, and this is then with their products drawn in, and you can clearly see that somehow these that on an axis like this, like these screens in Lecce, in a counter action, these informal moments also create a shape, or here that the several squares surrounding this informal accident result in that narrative. But and then there was one more restriction that the students had, is that they had to create the informality within the logic of the existing language of the place. So instead of adding a fully contemporary building, they had to use the shape languages of Pendrecht to make this. In a way, like nature and like Oxford, or like most of these examples that work well, even though the different layers of the formal and informal are very different, they all share the same green leaves, or they all share the same brown stone as a base. So Mirella worked on the Drieswoordstraat, this beautiful long building, and she designed a ballet school to fit at the end, and somehow the legs dance in between the trees, and the building becomes a large cantilevered structure on one end. I will just show these a bit to give you impressions. So there's a public entrance, as you can see on this side, underneath this cantilevered structure. And what actually was quite beautiful is that the students all worked vigorously using Revit, a building information modeling system, which is used to make these mass-produced buildings where you always have the same window module to reuse. But actually, because we had as a restriction that you could only use the vocabulary of the existing building, they just modeled this vocabulary in Revit, and then they could somehow use these pre-created products to then somehow fill in the newly designed parts. So actually thought it was a very beautiful meeting of something very contemporary with it. Here you can see the old living rooms being used as ballet schools, and apparently they have a Pina Bausch play on, and I actually think it also, by using this dogmatic approach of somehow just using the existing buildings, it gives actually quite a beautiful reflection on what these domestic elements, like these doors and windows of these Pendrecht houses, mean in different functions. And actually, I think it's a very charming thing to have that in a public building like this. It makes it more like a community center, more approachable. So, and then here, of course, the composition of the long order of the houses, which are still there, and then the modified intervention, which I thought was very pleasing. I also made these wonderful models. So Yannick made a bank from the Schuddebursstraat, two mirrored blocks, where he even borrowed from the surrounding structures to remodel this facade. So you can see here that the roof and the windows of the shops are somehow merged together into this almost Utzon-like base. So I'm just going through these. I realized that I've put in maybe a lot of student projects to somehow talk about, but there's a second part of my story as well. But these are just very beautiful images nonetheless. Johanna made a library in the Oldegaarde. This is the existing structure. We just walked by it. It's a higher structure at the end of the city. There are like 4 higher structures in Pendrecht, each demarking an edge, and this one is at the edge of the city, facing a park, and somehow the added volumetrics creates almost like an inviting public building on the corner of the town. The plants almost become Asnago Evenderesque, the way you move in between columns and slanted staircases, and the way the libraries find their place. In a way, of course, they all drew in a function, but in a way, functions change today. No, so I feel it's I don't feel it's a bad thing to make space first and find function after, in that sense. And a beautiful platform with a lecture hall overlooking this same park, being able to go all the way up to the roof. And Lara, the last one of Pendrecht, did a music jazz club hall from also 2 mirroring buildings. These ones are a bit heavy. Again, creating this moment within the formal access, inviting the people in. And here, these escalator cores almost become like a Baroque column relief, how they're like placed on top of each other and slowly shifted. This is the back, where there's still the existing formal houses, but again with the same elevator course, reminding you of what is to come. And I think it's also a wonderful idea to have this idea of the housing next to the public function, that in this very housing district, this really feeling like a place to live rather than a place for the city or a place for culture, that somehow this is still an important part of somehow the syntax. And again, a theater of space which somehow then plays all of a sudden with these existing exterior facades becoming interior facades, of course very fitting for these kind of more urban-like places, like a jazz club, where then all of a sudden you're like within the exterior building facade in that sense. So there was a little appendix to the studio where there were a few students who did the same exercise, but in Berlin. And Masha and Leander here worked on this wonderful neighborhood of Paul Mebes and Bruno Taut, which is really stunning. A lot of these neighborhoods in Berlin are incredibly stunning, with these beautiful loggia terraces, winter gardens, and a lot of beautiful trees which seem to grow naturally there in Berlin, like in Uncle Tom's Hütte. And then this is the Mebis part, and then on the other side you have the Bruno Taut part. Here you can see them together. On the right you have the Mebis, on the left you have the Bruno Taut. And they also somehow try to collide them together. So instead of having this quite bland infrastructural access through the middle that doesn't really get attributed and is more like a division within it, a series of public squares is created along the central axis, having a constantly changing level of publicness. So the first frontal square is an entrance square, and then there's quite a public square, and then slowly they become more intimate and private as they go up, and the buildings will let people through less and less. And it was actually quite wonderful. So each layer has a different kind of collision, allowing for a different kind of way of living. So they introduce like 6 or 7 ways of living together, communal housing. So this is a student house. You can see that the students can like walk in between these walls of these these buildings that have met. They can use the different staircases. Sometimes one staircase enters into a floor, and another staircase will then continue to another floor, and so each floor is somehow different and flexible. Here you have another floor, really creating these wonderful, actually I think really very nice collective spaces, which have this very informal character, which isn't designed, which is somehow the result of these two buildings meeting, and really gives this idea of that. A second building, which is, I don't remember what it is, I'm sorry. Let me see if it comes to me. This is one where there are like units, and there are 2 people living above each other, but they share a collective loggia, even in the distance. So here you can see this inner shell of the building. So here is where the one facade would stop, and there's where the other facade would stop, and some of the space in between. So the one outer facade and the other outer facade becomes a winter garden, a large winter garden, which is then shared by the houses living on top, and they can sit on the existing stairs that are cut off, and they can move underneath. So somehow in front of their facades, they get this other shared double high space, as if you're living in a forest of the existing building. And the final one, this is a mixed-use building with partially ateliers and partially houses, and on the ground floor you can just pass. They're beautiful, strangely shaped columns resulting from the intersections of the two houses. On the corners they're more formal, but in the middle they get these wonderfully strange shapes. And in the center, because the block has become so deep, there was space for an atrium cut out from the existing structure of the existing house, through which you then move from your living spaces to your atelier spaces. And atelier spaces are facing to the more public square, and the houses then face the first entrance square. This is in the wrong place. This is this house with these double high spaces facing each other. This is the one that we are now looking at, where you move underneath, and you have these strangely shaped columns, and you have this wonderful outside space in between your housing and working layers. In the process, a lot of new facades are created by combining these two logics of these facades, which I think very strong moments, sometimes almost undistinguishable from the existing, and then other times becoming more and more expressive as they meet in more strange ways. And as I was also saying before, they become less and less transparent. So the first one is just lifted, you can walk underneath. Then there's a cafe on the other side. Then the next one has a larger revolving door. We actually walk through quite a large collective space, and then slowly the doors get smaller and more informal. And then the last door is just the existing door of the houses as they are today. Last project in this series is by Mirela again, a project for a court in Berlin. We thought, can't we do the same exercise using a more traditional shape language? And this is in a way a beautiful inner courtyard in Berlin, where there are this very large ground formal facade on the front, more garden city-like facade on the left, and then another city facade on the right. And they all meet together in this big junction, but then somehow it seems like as if it never got ended, because then here there's just a park and somehow some backsides of facades. So this whole formal ensemble, as you enter with all these access, then just looks out onto this natural phenomena here in the middle of the city. It actually feels like as if when you're walking from this side, as if you're reaching the edge of the city and you're just looking on the landscape surrounding the city, or here that you're walking along the edge of the city. So in a way, to look for an architecture that has somehow this incidental quality, this raw, uncontrolled nature garden, you can again find the classical garden in here. And Mirela also went wild in somehow combining all these layers of the existing buildings, creating a glyptotheek added to this beautiful housing structure. And somehow this view, which used to look into nature, now looks into this building, which is almost like nature, or could almost be like this ruin that Le Corbusier shows when looking out the window. And yeah, the question is then, how do you use these existing elements to play with? There's this beautiful staircase which twists around this intersection of columns to then go up, and then here another one. You will like walk in between these cresses of these existing buildings to traverse the spaces. And even the floor somehow still leave a mark on the ceiling in the process. So here's the elevations. Maybe to go back to nature, I guess one of the reasons is of course why all these examples somehow worked is because they are all using a very consistent syntax, a very consistent selection of elements. Because in a way, of course, we have many large modernistic neighborhoods. I went to New Belgrade, which is quite beautiful, but of course, all the later additions are just growing on it like informal structures that are just getting added, and it doesn't create this wonderful dialogue between the formal and the informal, because the informal somehow speaks a completely different language than the formal. And I think that's in a way why in nature this dialogue between the formal and the informal can really work, because everything in the garden, everything in the landscape still is made out of leaves and grass and tree trunks, and they have a very consistent syntax in that sense. So I think that is why this exercise in Pendrecht worked quite well on a theoretical level, of course, because it somehow it's somehow all the elements, even though different, share the same logic. And I guess if you look at architecture, then of course something like Pompeii, where there's this very limited syntax, the place can be completely informal, and still it feels very consistent and logical and sensical, and everything has a very close relationship, because everything is consisting out this very limited vocabulary of elements, and due to the terrible disaster, it even got stripped down to tonal equality in it. So for the next studio, we then try to somehow look at this syntax, like what can we learn from this syntax, and what is the balance between using a very consistent language like columns or arches, and then somehow how much accidents and incidents can you make within these syntax. So we walked in the footsteps of the architecture research unit, because we got this wonderful guide from Philip and Florian about their trip to these Romanesque churches in France, which they used a lot for their project in South Korea. This library book hall, you can clearly see it if you put it next to this facade. We search for answers in this Romanesque, Normandic Romanesque churches, which seem to have a very strong ambition to speak the formal language of the classical buildings, but always seem to somehow mess it up in the process, resulting in these wonderful facades. So this is the second group where we went on a trip with. So it's very funny to then take these excursions to these places with them, and we viewed all these wonderful churches. And I think this is really, like you can say, the classical garden, where everything speaks the same language, and the exceptions and the accidents can be grave. And of course, there are many examples, no? And often it's somehow very closely related to time. So it's never designed like this, but it's somehow because of alterations and modifications over time. They create formal spaces, but somehow how these formal spaces connect, this is a space here, if you go to the right, becomes in a very informal way. They just have to solve it. And it's somehow a space that is not fully designed. It is somehow the result of some limitations, a causal result. There's this beautiful church in Vicenza, where in the apsis at the back, you have this wonderful collection of, I think, stolen columns or found columns from monuments, and new frescoes on the ceiling that all try to create order in it, in a fully unordered base building structure. But we could look at this arch, which is completely leaning in the wrong direction, and they still try to arrange it. And I think through it you get this wonderful coherency of disorder. And you often see it at these moments where there are two layers of the church, where there's like a new layer of a building being added to an old layer, and there's clearly a little moment within the plan where they have to somehow solve some things, and they have to add an extra column, or they have to. But like I said, for me, these are in the churches, which are often quite formal. These are the little pieces of uncontrolled nature, and you feel it that there are these niches there. And in a way, I'm always fascinated by the Gothic, or I'm getting more and more fascinated by the Gothic, because it somehow really is trying to connect everything within it, from the large structural elements to the shape of the spaces, to the details, to the furniture, to maybe even the objects that the priests use. Everything is somehow used within the same logic. So with the students, we looked at a lot of these examples and we tried to recreate them. This is of course, the cathedral in Cologne, for if somebody didn't recognize it yet, which is this enormous collection of colonnettes which are just added to each other, and they all have a meaning. They all have some kind of origin coming from the top, coming from a connection, the way the roof works. But when they all hit the floor, you do not understand the real logic anymore, and it becomes a beautiful collection of familiar objects. So the students, they all made models of these spaces. Masha took the Cologne, the Dom in Cologne, using rhino, which has a beautiful aesthetic. It's almost plastic-like visual feeling. And first, we try to somehow understand the syntax of these old monuments. And I was really surprised. I asked them, "Can you each model a Gothic church or something like that?" And then we didn't see each other for 3 weeks, and they came back with these incredible models. That's the nice thing about teaching in Germany. And they're very mathematical, very exact. But you also still see these beautiful ideas about the Gothic in this essay by James Hall, where somehow the Gothic could be derived from just the natural shapes, like as if you bind twigs to each other, and the way the twigs bend, then create this space, and all of a sudden there is again a natural origin to this shape. And actually he could somehow derive all these things from twigs meeting and twigs being bound together with knots, and the knots are even shown in the architecture as rosettas, and even more finer lacing of somehow tree heads, which are then split and added together. And it really is such a one-to-one relationship with the Gothic, which I thought was really stunning. And that we did a trip, me and Jantje, to see some other Gothic buildings in France. In the most small towns, they have these wonderful lacings of layers of these twigs being cut up and added into layers, and really creating these natural phenomena where the order is so fine that at some point the order becomes all-encompassing. So here you can see that there are several layers behind each other, which each have quite a formal structure, but because they do it off the perspective, they create a beautiful, almost leaf-like quality of as if you're looking at a tree blowing in the wind. And what is then quite stunning is, of course, that with the Gothic you can then really become part of it. You can enter it, and it's all around you. No, it's like the roof of the Duomo in Milan, where every element has some kind of a Gothic ornamentation, and it's a wonderful journey. And again, the structural, like here the flying buttresses, but of course also the functional, like the railings to hold on to, and even the staircases are framed with these same ornaments. So the architect creates this very clear syntax, and everything is solved from the largest thing to the smallest thing. Nora made a beautiful model of the roof of the Duomo in Milan. And maybe one of my favorites is, of course, the Gothic cathedral in Prague, in the middle of the fortress, where you really have this layer of different interventions which are like added to each other. And of course, the latest interventions done by Plechnik, which are also wonderful additions. And again, here, I think this is a beautiful moment where in this buttress, also a staircase is introduced. So you can see the staircase twisting along the buttress going up, and there's really no difference anymore between structure, architecture, furniture. Everything is somehow treated in the same context. Yeah, that's something that we rarely see today in that sense. You can see this chair. This is the just taken from a book from Friedrich Mielke. I found it there, that it's existence, a guy who's crazy about staircase, and it's a staircase which is a twist and twist on. As you move back to the buttress, so you're outside each time. No, here you're inside, and then you twist, and then you walk outside out of the structure, and then you're momentarily above the naked sky, and then you enter the building again to then twist again into the structure. Yeah, so like I said, furniture growing from the structure, sculptures growing from the furniture, even the woodwork has the same logic, and even the religious sacraments also are little Gothic objects, all becoming part, like in nature, the larger forest as the smaller leaf, all are part of the same logic. And of course in the UK, you're no different, and it's really even so dense, almost like a forest. And in this cathedral in Glasgow, you also have this beautiful moments where then even the structure of the buttress is incorporated in the aesthetic profiling of the wall, and everything starts to move through each other. So these are wonderful things. And maybe if we then look at more contemporary examples, I feel that this circular track up to the roof of the Fiat factory in Turin has a lot of the same qualities. I mean, there's also ornament here, there's also structure, but then the structure is also ornamented in the same way as the ornament on the facade, and there's almost no difference anymore between what is intentional and what is ornamental, and structure and ornament become part of the same thing. So for me, this is also a very Gothic structure in that sense. Even more contemporary examples like this Church of the Autostrade, of course, has very clear links to the Gothic in the same way. But I would even go as far as to say that somebody like Jean Nouvel in Paris, which started off as this very abstract modernist facade. I always thought it was, but it isn't. It's actually this wonderful layering of different systems, which each have their own logic, but just seem to accidentally meet in the middle. And what I quite like is the moment when he's starting to use different kinds of systems. So let's see. This is the back where again you could say the facade, which is in a way an architectural element, and then the elevator, which is a technical installation element. They all also speak the same language. So like the structure and the furniture in the church, this is in a way for me the same thing. And I quite like it at these moments where he's actually how do you say it, allowing for quite different structures. No, it's not this, these are quite thick profiles here, then the roof has the ceiling is a very thin system, and then that same system is repeated on the facade, but then the outer stair has then a stainless steel railing. So they all have another kind of fineness, but because all the systems are quite related, it still becomes part of a larger, almost Gothic-like structure, even to the installational course where the T profiles are also detailed in a certain way to fit this logic. And maybe if we then go to a less architectural context, airports for me are also definitely Gothic structures, because there's often also so many systems at play, from the furniture to the architecture, which all somehow seem to be made by technology minded people, like you would find on a ship, or as you would find in a space station, that somehow everything is somehow industrial, and it's, for me, has also a strong relationship to the Gothic, that this wall isn't just a wall, but it's a system of panels, like the facade is also a system of windows, and that even the furniture within that, like these walkway lines, also become part of this same logic. And you have it in a lot of these spaces, like train stations, where even the furniture, like the trains, which in a way is also elements, speak similar languages as the architecture surrounding it. All this modular system on a smaller grain, going side by side in a way not unlike a Gothic cathedral. So I think that's an interesting approach, and maybe even these more banal architectures, like this interior of the European Union building, also has a similar kind of logic, where everything is somehow shaped from the same bone. Things do not always align, but it somehow makes sense because it somehow has a similar kind of grain to it. And of course, in Belgium, at the coast, you could also draw similar parallels to these kind of systems that are actually quite a narrow shaped language, but are very versatile and contradictory at the same time. So okay, but that last part I invented only recently. But for the studio, we look mainly at these Gothic and Romanesque buildings, and of course, there the meeting of different parts are different parts because they were built in different times. They were built by different generations, and therefore there was a miscommunication, and therefore there were accidents and incidents happening. And of course, I guess today, if you build a new building, you can of course make instant history, like Lodgens also did, and that's not an uncommon thing. But it's of course has the fear of being a bit anecdotal. So I was thinking, what else is there where sorry, I'm distracted because my daughter fell, but my girlfriend is there. What did I want to say? Yeah, so in these examples of historic buildings, there are the time layers which make out the different layers that somehow miscommunicate and have to find solutions in between. What I like about these industrial structures is that often there are different processes that are meeting. It also is clearly one syntax. It's also clearly one logic that somehow shapes the whole. But if you look at these beautiful pictures by Helen van Begger, then you can clearly see that each industrial process needed support, like these primary stage of this blast furnace. I think it's the cooling, I guess. And then here you have the main blast furnace. But then this upper part has a different logic than what's below it, and the stair has also its own logic. So each logic is very logical and very systematic, but somehow the way they're put together, that's less important. I mean, sometimes also if you look at it on a larger scale of the whole Zeche, of the whole mine site, there are often, of course, due to topographical limitations, different elements of the process placed in different ways. and then these very intrinsically logical elements just meet at some point in the middle. So I thought it would be an interesting idea to see how we can translate this, how we can play with this and play with the architectural language. So this is what I'm going to show you now is actually not the whole studio. This is a small exercise, but it actually got a lot of very nice results. So that's why I want to show it. So each student got an industrial structure from the Beggars. They modeled it, and then they had to apply a logic of a historic syntax on top of it. So here, Eva applied the logic of the Römische Bäder by Schinkel on top of this this industrial structure. And so here you can see the original industrial structure, and here you can see somehow the architectural result. And what was very important that it wasn't one-to-one, no? So of course for steel the logic would be crosses, but I guess if you're making something out of wood, you don't make these. Well, you can make crosses, but you could also make it like this. So more like in the way Schinkel would have done it in the Römische Bäder, still following the main structural principles, and it created these very wonderful architectural sensations that are not completely logical, that have an origin which isn't completely coming from a design perspective. There is something that just happened, an accident, and they create these spaces which feel very familiar and definitely share a language that we all know, but also again an object which doesn't seem to be designed by any sensible man. And that's in a way for me a kind of architecture which very much excites me, because I feel that we shouldn't just live in a world where everything is intended. We should also live in a world with a lot of things that are unintended. And I'm wondering how consciously you can create something unintended in that sense. I'm just gonna go through this. I realize I'm already have talked an hour. But they're very wonderful. So these are, of course, these stacked processes. You get this wonderful, almost Paul Delvaux like Gothic industrial structures. I somehow feel it was a very valuable exercise to not always deal within your own brain, but to somehow look at things which are only partly created by you. So very thin cast iron reinterpretations. And again, how like in Glasgow, how the different profiles intersect, no? How the structural profiles meet in a certain level, and they're like things laying more, which are meeting at the top end, but also things that are more into the distance. And I actually quite liked it that we could design Gothic with the students. No, I mean it's a very surreal idea that today we would design something Gothic, and of course you're also afraid that we wouldn't be able to deal with it anymore, or that it's like that you need this whole history of the Beaux-Arts to really somehow even start talking about it. But I mean, just as a theoretical exercise, I think it's quite intriguing that that we were able to somehow go this far within this logic. And I really like it how they change, no? So how they're like not the same, but how it makes sense how the wood cuts into the block, and how the one thing is held up, the column is held up by a beam, which is held up by another cantilevered structure. I mean, these Becher books are, of course, also very inspiring. So Stephanie looked at the Church of the Four Fountains, and even used the slightly curved columns of this beautiful church in Rome, where there's also actually incidents. So you can see here that the facade, the street facade, is slightly rotated in relationship to the inner logic of the plan, and it creates this very nice, very slight accident of the rotated window, which he's clearly trying to solve, but actually I quite like it that somehow that doesn't get fully solved. So yeah, and that's the formal city against the informal incident.